Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this early April morning when people have many, many things on their calendars. And as you know, this is the final colloquium for the Race, Equity, and Social Justice series for the 2021 academic year. I'm Bonnie Thornton Dill, Dean of the College and professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. We launched this series a year ago, this is the second year. We launched it in 2020 as part of the college's broader initiative on race, equity, and social justice, which has been developed around the goal of understanding and dismantling structural racism. The broader initiative includes transforming curriculum, reducing discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expanding the impact of the college's long-standing and continuing scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice. Throughout the series, we have sought to incorporate President Pine's focus on racial justice and identity, and have welcomed students participating as part of the college's Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In ARHU, part of our approach to this program is to offer opportunities for students to be exposed to the many different ways faculty in the college study and teach about race, equity, and justice. Throughout the year, I've invited faculty experts from across ARHU to discuss their scholarship and creative projects. This year, we continue these conversations with discussions of the impact of systemic racism on Blacks and also on Asian, Jewish, LGBTQ+, Arab, and Muslim populations in the US. The format for each session includes a brief presentation followed by a conversation with me, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'm going to request that you keep your microphones on mute during the presentation, but during the last 15 minutes or so of our time together, you will be invited to join the conversation. So please think of questions and jot down notes you might have for the speaker as we go along. You may place these questions in the chat and send them directly to Associate Dean Patrick Warfield, who will be moderating the Q&A. Or when the time comes, use the Zoom's raise hand feature, and Patrick will be on the lookout for that as well. Please note this event is being recorded for future viewing on ARHU's website. So today's session features Shay Hazkani, an assistant professor in our Department of History and in the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Program and Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Hazkani is a historian of the modern Middle East, whose work has focused on the interactions between elites and non-elites, and how ideas which emanate from state institutions were transformed and subverted as they made their way to the reflections and conduct of ordinary people. His first book, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War, published in April of 2021 by Stanford University Press, recasts the 1948 war in Palestine through a socio-cultural history of the conflict's ordinary actors and its transnational reverberation. The book draws on never-before-used personal letters in Arabic and Hebrew, which challenge the war accounts of politicians and generals, showing that the stories that ordinary people told themselves about the war were far more diverse and complex than the nationalist fervor and unquestioning loyalty to the cause usually imputed to them. Dear Palestine was longlisted for the 2021 Cundill History Prize, and it is forthcoming in Hebrew. A former journalist, Dr. Hazkani is also an activist for public humanities. A documentary based on his book will be released in Israel later this summer. And in January of 2019, he petitioned the Israeli High Court of Justice together with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, demanding that the Israeli Domestic Intelligence Service, the Shin Bet, release documents from its archives on the suppression of Mizrahi protest in the 1950s. I'm sure he'll tell us more about that. While the petition is seeking to declassify specific documents, if accepted, it will set a much larger precedent for archival declassification in the Israeli secret services. So this morning, Dr. Hazkani will share insights from his new research project as we discuss the intra-Jewish struggle against racism. So please welcome Dr. Shay Hazkani.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court case was dismissed a few months ago by the court with some interesting possibility for further litigations, but we are still very, very interested in pursuing these causes. I'm really, really excited to be here with you as part of this important series. And thank you especially for expanding the discussion about race, racism, equity, and justice beyond the United States. These questions are American questions, but they're also global questions. And today we'll be taking a look at the intra-Jewish struggle against racism, that is, the internal fight inside the Jewish society in Israel against racism of Jews who originated from the Middle East and North Africa, also known as Mizrahi Jews. But of course, as a historian, I can't help but doing some framing and giving some context to the questions surrounding race and justice in the question of Israel-Palestine more broadly. As is well known, the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine through the Zionist movement sought to address, among other things, growing anti-Semitism against Jews in the European context. And of course, this old form of racism is not gone, not here in the US and not elsewhere. But when we have this difficult conversation about race, racism, equity, and justice in Israel-Palestine, we should not confine ourselves to the discussion of anti-Semitism, and we also need to acknowledge the structures of inequality that were created by the establishment of the State of Israel. As a Jewish state, it was established on the ruins of another civilization, Arab Palestine. 3/4 of its inhabitants were expelled or fled their homes and not allowed to return to them. In that sense, the war in 48 gave rise to a regime of superiority of one group, that is the Jews, over another group, the Palestinians. That's not just a historical fact, it continues even as we speak through, among other things, a military occupation in the West Bank and to a degree also in the Gaza Strip, and a system of systematic discrimination against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Now, today, I want to look at another facet of race in Israel inside the Jewish society, which is about 80% of Israel's formal citizens. Let me just try and share my PowerPoint. That's always a challenging thing. So 1 second as I load that. There we go. And I'm sharing this. Hopefully you will be able to see this. Okay, so the ethnic composition of Israeli Jews is very, very diverse. But we actually only have a partial sense of that diversity. Unlike the US, Israel makes it very difficult to determine the demographic composition of its Jewish population under the premise that all it matters is whether one is Jewish or not, but not where they came from. But of course, as a scholar, whenever a claim is being made by a state that something doesn't matter, well, we sort of immediately know that it matters tremendously. And for our story, a racist view that Jews who originated from the Middle East and North Africa were backwards, inferior, or quote unquote Arab-like was used for decades to denigrate them and also keep them in a subordinated position economically compared to the Israeli hegemonic group of European Jews, also known as Ashkenazi Jews. One must, of course, remember that Zionism, a late 19th century movement, was conceived by European Jews primarily for solving the problems of European Jews, and only with the realization of the extent of the extermination of European Jewry in the Holocaust was it that the Zionist movement really turned to the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa as possible immigrants. Bonnie, you mentioned my book, Dear Palestine, which offers what historians often call a history from below. That is decidedly not the history of quote unquote great men, but that of sort of ordinary people, women and men. And one group that Dear Palestine follows closely are Moroccan Jews. That was once a thriving Jewish community in North Africa. In fact, the largest Jewish concentration in the Middle East. In 1948, Morocco had 250,000 Jews, most left to Israel by the early 60s. Now, we don't have the time, unfortunately, to really dive into the history of Moroccan Jews. The only thing I'd say here is that, like Jewish communities elsewhere, Moroccan Jews had known periods of persecution, but also of prosperity. In the modern period, of course, they fared much better than Eastern European Jews. And while there were certainly incidents of attacks against them, they were generally accepted as part of the fabric of the Moroccan society, and to a degree even of Moroccan nationalism. That may not be true for all Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. Each community have their own distinct history, and I don't want to collapse all that history together. We're talking about 1 million Jews or so. Now, only about 20,000 Moroccan Jews arrived in Israel in 1948, 1949, and about 1,000 of them joined the Israeli army to fight in the 1948 war, known in Israel as the War of Independence. Coming to Israel was a very challenging and difficult experience for these Moroccan Jews. The way we know this is because we can see it in their personal letters. And the way that we have those letters is due to the existence of this big brother apparatus that was called the Postal Censorship Bureau. It's basically an Israeli early version of the NSA. And from 1948 all the way to 2004, this Israeli Postal Censorship Bureau intercepted, copied, and stored the personal letters of Jews and Palestinians, of course, secretly, for the purpose of studying their state of mind and sort of spying on individuals that were seen as a risk. And I'll come back to why Moroccan Jews were seen as a risk. But first, let's hear from a Moroccan Jewish soldier telling his experience fighting for Israel in 1948. And I have the letter here. I'll read it for you. And this is what he writes. A few weeks ago, I was in a soldiers' club when a quarrel started between a Palestine-born soldier and a Moroccan one. The quarrel soon escalated into an all-out fight, which included the following slurs: down with the Moroccan, kill the Moroccan, etc. I thought I was in Morocco, hearing the famous call, down with the dirty Jew. Believe me, I left the hall with tears in my eyes. But in any case, this won't change a thing in my belief. I came here as an idealist, and I will remain one for the rest of my life. And as for my parents, I want them to come as soon as possible, because it is better to hear dirty Moroccan than dirty Jew. So despite the racism this soldier clearly encountered, he felt that Israel offered sort of a safe haven to all Jews, one that he could not find in Morocco. But many Moroccan Jews did not necessarily feel the same. Here's another Moroccan soldier writing from the exact same time. And this is what he writes, and this is a difficult letter. As I wrote to you, the European Jews who suffered tremendously from the Hitleristic Nazism see themselves as a superior race, and the Sephardic, that is Mizrahi Jews, as belonging to an inferior one. The poor African who came here from afar and was not required to leave his home because of racial discrimination is now humiliated at every turn. Instead of gratitude, they treat us like savages or unwelcomed elements. Bloodline rules here. Now, this letter actually requires some decoding. It's not so straightforward as it may seem. On the one hand, the soldier is, of course, using this vocabulary from World War II, from Nazi Germany, to describe the elite group in Israel of European Jews, suggesting that they created some form of racial hierarchy based on blood, with themselves at the top. Another subversive element in this letter is the assertion that unlike European Jews who were forced out of Europe because of anti-Semitism, North Africans did not suffer the same racial discrimination in their countries of origin from Moroccan Muslims. And this, of course, goes against a very common Zionist narrative, which saw the bringing of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa to Israel as a rescue mission that averted a second Holocaust supposedly perpetrated by the Arabs. Now, the Army Command was extremely concerned of these trends that they secretly intercepted from the personal letters of soldiers, from statistics that it secretly collected from personal letters, that they learned that over 70% of Moroccan Jewish soldiers in the IDF wanted to leave Israel and return to Morocco because of what they defined as racial discrimination in their letter. And these soldiers also called their families to stay in Morocco rather than come to Israel. From 1949 to 1953, about 2,500 Moroccan immigrants to Israel made the journey back to Morocco, of a total of about 40,000 Moroccans who resided in Israel at the time. Now, while these returnees represent only about 6% of Moroccans in Israel, it's nearly double the return rate of immigrants from European or American origin who left Israel. As a matter of policy, Israel confiscated the passports of Jewish immigrants coming from many countries and refused to return them. Now, anger at these policies and sort of racism more broadly caused Moroccans in Israel to seek new and creative ways sometimes to leave the country. In 1951, the Israeli police exposed a ring of Moroccan newcomers trying to forge Moroccan passports, presumably to allow for the return of other Moroccan Jews to Morocco. Another illicit activity also discovered with these letters was using cargo ships to secretly leave Israel. Israel made it very difficult to obtain these exit permits, making the option of hiding inside these cargo ships very, very attractive. Now, my new research picks up where I left off in Dear Palestine to examine the lives of these Moroccan Jews in the decade following the 1948 war. That decade culminated in 1959 with a major revolt in Israel known as the Wabi-Salib Revolt. That is a revolt against the sort of Ashkenazi elite of the country, of Jews, of these Moroccan Jews. Now, Wabi-Salib was a Palestinian neighborhood of Haifa, whose residents fled shortly after the occupation of the city by Jewish forces in 1948. Many of the neighborhood's new residents were Jews from North Africa who abandoned agricultural settlements to which they had been sent by the government in search of a better life. By 1959, the neighborhood housed some 15,000 people, with families living in shacks or crumbling buildings, crowded into tiny homes in what were once these relatively spacious Palestinian houses. Some of the rooms housed 8 or 9 people. Many of the men were unemployed and the children were not attending school. And overlooking this neighborhood of Wadi Salib was a wealthy Ashkenazi-dominated neighborhood by the name of Hadar HaKarmel, which would serve as the main target for this militant uprising. And so on July 9th, the revolt was sparked after the police shot an inebriated Moroccan worker inside a Wadi Salib coffee shop. He was severely wounded by the police gunfire and was rumored to have succumbed to his wounds. Here's another resident of the neighborhood that described the Moroccan retaliation to his family in Morocco in a letter intercepted. You should have seen the attacks on the city the day after. Display windows shattered, cars burned. And throughout the week, everywhere Moroccans lived, there was demonstrations and riots as they were asking for nothing more than work and equality. The dirty Europeans always promise housing, work, etc., but they only give it to the Ashkenazi who enjoy it all. Now, in Israeli history, the Wabi-Salib Revolt is often described as an explosion of anger without rhyme or reason. And I would actually argue that it's anything but. In fact, I argue that the severe racism that Moroccan Jews encountered in Israel brought about this gradual process of radicalization, which culminated in this revolt against Ashkenazi in Israel. And it was an attempt to really change the rules of the game inside Israel. And that strategy of military resistance actually replaced the aspiration to return to Morocco. The reason was this, that it was that for many Jews, a return to Morocco in the mid-50s did not look like a viable option anymore. And that's in the context of the Moroccan independence from France in 1956. And so that resistance strategy was changed. Rather than seeking to return to Morocco, a revolt to try and overhaul the system from within. Now, I call this radicalization, and I mean an active process of embracing radical politics and seeking to sort of fundamentally alter the political system in Israel. And in this case, radicalization was apparent by actually introducing race into the Israeli discourse and seeking to leverage this discourse for a redistribution of resources, primarily among Jews. And examining the sentiments of these ordinary Moroccan Jews throughout the 50s, I argue that this radicalization was in some ways, quote unquote, learned from elsewhere. First, it developed against the backdrop of the Moroccan struggle for independence against French colonialism. However, other anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles around the world in the 50s also became influential. Let me give you just a couple of examples and we'll wrap up. Now, the most obvious inspiration for this militant revolt in Wabi-Salib came from Morocco itself. Throughout the 50s, Morocco had seen a major anti-colonial revolt against the French, who were in control of Morocco since 1912. This revolt resulted in the 1956 independence of Morocco. And the letters actually suggest that Moroccan Jews in Israel decided to mimic the Arabs of Morocco in their anti-colonial violence against the French. Here's one letter. Morocco Jews in Israel acted like Morocco's Arabs, flipped cars, broke display windows, burnt and shouted like the Arabs after the police killed a Moroccan. So the immigrant in this intercepted letter depicted a situation where Moroccans in Israel looked to the Arabs of Morocco in order to fight what they perceived as a form of colonialism in their new homeland. Now, I actually propose that the radicalization found in letters may also have been influenced by the Moroccan press. A survey of French and Arabic newspapers in Morocco revealed extensive coverage in Morocco of the revolt in Israel. That's really second only to the coverage in Israel. The revolt was French front page news in most Moroccan newspapers for several weeks, and much of the coverage was actually spearheaded by one person by the name of Andres Semama, a Tunisian Jew who was Le Monde's correspondent in Israel. And he was one of the first to actually suggest that Israel had what he called a racial problem. Of course, something that Israeli officials denied then, and this is something that is still not widely accepted within the Israeli internal discourse. Another source of inspiration that is, I thought was really interesting for this radicalization, perhaps maybe the most interesting in our story, was other disenfranchised groups from around the world who were engaged in anti-racist or anti-colonial violence throughout the 1950s. For example, you find direct comparisons in letters between Wabi-Salib and a small uprising in Durban, South Africa against the apartheid regime in 1959, and in London in 1958, where West Indians rebelled against the racism of working class whites known as the Teddy Boys. And the similarities to Wabi-Salib were actually significant. Like Moroccans, the West Indians were a recent immigrant community to Britain. And like Moroccans, West Indians were accused by the authorities of spreading crime and violence. And like Moroccans, West Indians organized these violent reprisals against groups that believed in white supremacy. Now, the Wabi-Salib Revolt ultimately failed at overhauling the system inside Israel. There was no redistribution of wealth in the 1960s, nor were most Moroccans incorporated into the group of Jews that ruled the country. The rebels' limited willingness to engage other disenfranchised groups in Israel may have played a role in that outcome. There was no discussion among Moroccans of the depopulation of Palestine, of most of its Arab inhabitants during the 48 war, and even those Palestinians who became Israeli citizens and were languishing under military rule at the time in the 50s were largely excluded from the Wabi-Salib Revolt. In fact, the 1959 rebels were almost exclusively North Africans with only limited participation by other Jews from the Islamic world. Now, a little more than a decade later, in 1971, the Israeli Black Panthers movement, that was, of course, modeled after the Oakland Black Panthers, emerged. It was an interesting movement. It was a pan-Mizrahi activist movement, meaning that it brought together not only North Africans, but Jews from the Middle East and North Africa more broadly. And of course, this radical discourse became ubiquitous. However, a joint sort of Mizrahi Palestinian grassroots movement against racism did not take root. Most Mizrahi continued to prefer the prospect of being included into the country's ruling ethnicity, the Jews, over the creation of a new society that would abrogate the superiority of one group over all others. I would at least argue that sort of strategic choice has not yet changed. But I can only talk about the past. Thank you so much for your listening and attention. Fortunately, I cannot hear you. Bonnie may need to unmute.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding my mouse to unmute. Thank you so much, Shay. That's really fascinating, and I can see where this grows out of your earlier work in some ways. So there's several things that I think about as I was listening to you. One was just this whole concept of racism, because early in your remarks, you talk about anti-Semitism as an old form of racism. And yet then we take that experience, that the impact of that old form of racism on the development of the Israeli state and all of that, and it into a new phenomenon, a new setting, and begin to see some new forms of racism. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is here, but I'm interested in your commenting on this kind of the ways in which these things manifest themselves in these different settings. I'd like to hear you say more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and that's really an important question. It has to do with what historians often talk about and call the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the time. And so much closer to World War II and the Holocaust, it was certainly seen as, the extermination of Jews as the result of racism and anti-Semitism. And that sort of language, that discourse, was seen as easily transferable to other cases where groups were being, treated with racism or discriminated against based on a perceived racial difference. Now, later on, in some ways, it became less common because of all sorts of potentially historical developments and developments in the way that we talk about the Holocaust and the the genocide in that context, that has disappeared to some degree. Although anyone who listens to Israeli media would immediately see that the Holocaust references are very, very common. That is not to say that the internal Jewish struggle against racism is equivalent or parallel, right, to the Holocaust of World War II. No, but it is very interesting to see how common that discourse of leveraging this idea of anti-racist was already common in the 50s, immediately after the conclusion of the Second World War, and we see that really across the board in those intercepted letters that I like very much and worked on for over a decade. I should probably move on to another set of sources, but I really found them amazing because they're very raw, right? They tell us something that you don't find in the media outlets of the time, of our time, of that time, because people say and reflect how they feel, usually under the assumption that that will only be revealed to their loved ones or relatives, and we have that historical source that this big brother source is truly very, very strong, I think, and touching in some ways.
Well, speaking of your sources, which are really fascinating, and for people who are not familiar with your book, I think one of the things that's striking is the contrast between kind of state propaganda and the ways in which the state represents the various groups of people who are fighting, and then the letters that the soldiers themselves write. I mean, it's a real treasure trove, and I can see why you worked on it for 10 years. I don't know that you should leave it because this is what's striking me, that you have minded in a different way in this new work. In other words, but it's still kind of the same process of the stories of those who have been ignored, excluded, not necessarily, their voices have not been heard. Their side of the story has not been heard. And then you're telling another side of the story and unearthing some things that maybe people would rather not hear. I don't know. I mean, and so I'm interested in both. I mean, so there's a lot of stuff that I'm interested in here, but one of the things is the reception of your work, the reception of this bottom-up story about the ways how Palestinian and Jewish Israeli fighters saw themselves, and now another bottom-up story about the racial conflict in Israeli society that maybe is also not a story that people want to hear a lot. So you're traveling in some interesting territory, and I'm wondering both how that is for you and how your work has been being received.
Yeah, wow, that's a complicated question, and thank you for that. I worked as in my first 2 years as a journalist for about 7 years, both on radio and on TV, and there were very sort of clear confines of not only what you can say, and we know that, but as a journalist, but also the sort of like the voice. We used to be sent a lot as a radio correspondent to do something called a collage. Go into, I was a correspondent in the West Bank and covered a lot of the suicide bombing during the Second Palestinian Intifada. Go and record people in the street to see how they feel. But of course, you come back to the studio and then the editors listen to the material, and 85% of it is deemed something that cannot be played on the air. And fortunately, in academia, I really, and that's a huge advantage. You can bring these voices. They make me and they make some of the listeners and some people reading feel uncomfortable. But I think that where else are we going to have these uncomfortable conversations, right? This is what we're here for in academia. And I had a mix of responses. Some very excited, some very angry, and that is great. Engage, and that's fine. I mean, I'm happy for those angry responses than I am for the excited one. What was interesting is that a lot of these stories, I think, have not been told or have almost not been told before. And I had people reach out to me from all over the world saying, that's actually my father's or my mother's story. It wasn't a celebrational story. It wasn't a story that fit the mold. So we didn't really talk about it much, but, just I got some emails like from Australia and from South Africa, because I look at a lot of these, among other Jewish volunteers who came in 48 to fight in the context of the 48 war. And I got some letters and emails from the Arab world, because I try to do the same for these Arab fighters that came in 48. And that is very, very gratifying to receive these emails. Some are very excited. Some wanted to argue about a point or two. That is all perfectly great. And yeah, that's what I'm here for. I mean, that's what we're doing.
Well, that takes me to this other question about public humanities. I mean, I use the example of the court, of suing the court for access to documents, but it seems to me that the line between your public humanities work and it kind of is a through line in some ways from your journalistic background, but also I'm interested in how you see going forward using your research and scholarship to inform and engage communities beyond the university.
To be completely honest, that's really what I care most about in some fundamental ways. It's an academic book with 1,000 footnotes, and whoever wants to dig into these footnotes, be my guest. But I've, since basically the age of 17, I have been in some ways one trick pony. I've solely worked on what's often been called the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israel-Palestine question. That is what I care about. I am I admit that immediately. And I care about, people looking at more complicated stories and more nuanced stories. Now, it's very difficult for me to do, to go on social media and explain these stories or to do some of, but I put these different narratives out there. And I understand many people would never encounter them, but some that will, I'm very excited about. And so recently, a week ago, we signed a contract for a Hebrew version of this book. This is not an academic book. This will be a book that will be, sold in stores, etc., for interested audiences. And I'm hoping for that an Arabic version will be published as well. There's a documentary loosely based on some of these stories. And so that has really, really been important to me, together with this sort of more academic, I'm talking with the dean, so I should probably not say, oh, I only care about that. But, yeah.
We care about public humanities. It's very important because people need to know what we do and why it matters to them. And that's in a way the story that you're telling here. So, anyway, I'm a fan. I'm a fan. Tell me a little bit about how this moves into your teaching and yeah, because. And I'm thinking, you're a history teacher and historians care about sources, and you came across some sources and some unusual sources. So how does this affect your teaching?
Yeah, and I think there's something about these personal letters, also some of the propaganda, state propaganda material, but that people would be more familiar with, like that's something they've seen before, but something about these personal letters that the point is not that every single word that people had written in a certain historical moment is exactly how things happen, right? That's all we care about. But capturing that moment in its real time has really been useful for me in teaching. And really, the idea that you can work with students on reading these primary sources, right? Reading a personal letters and saying something interesting about it. Not that what's in the letter is exactly how things happen. That is not what we're after, but telling us something about the time, about the sentiments, making a historical argument, which has been is really, really important, right? Not just framing how you feel in the sense of opinion. That's really something that has been really, really important to me, and those sources have really been useful. But I want to also acknowledge that these are very challenging conversations, and I am trying to, when we have them in class, right, these conversations about the origins of the state of Israel, about race in the Israeli or in the internal Jewish society. These are difficult conversations. Broadly speaking, we do see some significant changes in the younger generations in the United States, both Arab American and Jewish students, and some of the ways they engage and discuss these questions. But we do this. I mean, you can. The idea is that in classroom, I want to say that you can say everything. I mean, you can, in a sense that it is a safe place, not as safe in the sense that I am there to make people feel happy and content about their personal feeling. No, we are here for something else. But you can, say things that and we can talk about them in an engaged, sustained, scholarly manner that will hopefully be fruitful to you, to me, etc. Right? That's what we're doing, and I love these sources because they make my a lot of my work much easier. Hope that answers your question.
No, it does. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to open it up to Patrick. But since we were talking about teaching, and of course, we talk about one of the things in Terrapin Strong, and we make this transcript available so that students can watch it and people can use it in different ways, is all about identity. And so I'm interested in how, because it may not, if your own identity connects to this work, and how it influences the lens through which you see this work, or maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, it is, of course. I mean, a lot of what we do in some ways is, of course, personal. I grew up in Israel, and I've worked on these topics for many years. And in fact, I was still a journalist when these letters literally landed on my head by accident. And I was in the archives and doing something else as a TV correspondent when I found these. And the minute I read them, I didn't know, how to write a book, certainly, or what to do with them. But I knew that they told a story, or stories, I should say, that were just vastly different than the stories that I grew up knowing, right, in the Israeli education system, but also for those interested in Israel, Palestine, in the American education system. So very, very different stories. And in fact, I ended up sort of leaving that world of journalism and pursuing a master's and then a PhD. It took a long time to actually work on these sources, because I really thought there was something that is worth telling, and a story worth telling. So in some ways, it's a deeply personal story.
Thank you for that, Patrick. I see there's some questions in the chat and hands raised. So let me turn it over to you, and then we'll keep the conversation going.
Certainly, yeah, we've got lots of things coming in. So I see we do have a hand raised. Fatima, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you so much, Patrick. Shay, thank you. This is wonderful. And I think that young Israelis who clearly care about all these values are going for a long time benefit from this work as they think about the future of Israel and how they imagine themselves. My question is, are other studies done about other Jews immigrating to Israel, and could there then be some parallels or differences and things that kind of shed light on the context? And I'm saying this in the context that in late 1980s, probably in 1989, 10 years after the Iranian Revolution, Ahmed and I met a Iranian Jewish couple in the house of a friend, middle-aged, not really elderly, and they were returning to Iran. And they were saying, and my reaction was, oh my God, you're going back to the Islamic Republic, are you sure, and their reaction was, we had respect there. We were somebody there, we're nobody here. And, but they also told us that their I think they had 2 teenagers who were thinking about possibly staying or returning and so on. So obviously their take wasn't exactly the take of the children, but that was a very eye-opening. I mean, I'm not going to obviously generalize one story to the story of all the Iranian Jews, but both Ahmed and I were really shocked to hear that. I was wondering if people have done studies of other Jews, including Iranian Jews in Israel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fatima, for this question. I think certainly there are some new studies looking at that movement of return. Now, I want to be careful because the letters I present, I really try not to romanticize them. I mean, we're talking about a lot of these places that are, authoritarian regimes, right? Deeply repressive, where torture, etc. And while certainly we saw some movement of return, but then we sometimes even saw a return from the return, right? So we have that as well, including in the Israeli context. Sometimes they returned to Israel a second time, sometimes they immigrated elsewhere. So these stories get very complicated in Morocco, where Jews were generally, and certainly there were instances of persecution, but in my new study, I actually tried to look at both what's going on in Morocco and what's going on in Israel. There's many people, including those who returned to Morocco, decide by the late 50s that Morocco, after the end of French colonialism, would not allow them the upward mobility that they were hoping, and they immigrate, sometimes to Israel, sometimes elsewhere. Now, of course, in the Israeli historiography, in the Israeli story, their immigration is depicted either because of their sort of a messianic Zionist belief or because the Arabs were out to get them. The story, that's sometimes the case, maybe, but their stories are, of course, are much more complicated. And that's why I love those letters. I'm sorry to keep going back to that, because they tell us this full range of human emotions that explain, right? And I look at a lot of these letters talking about why do people come and why they go back and how. And I really think that captures this complexity, this tapestry of why this is done. And certainly, we still, in the context of Morocco and of course signing these agreements with Israel, we see a much more discussion about Jews going to live there, etc., in a different context these days, though.
Thank you. Then, thank you so much. Kelly Flanagan had a question in the chat about how we name things. If you could speak a little bit more about the title of your book, Dear Palestine, when we know that there's a lot of anxiety around how we name things in that part of the world.
Yeah, well, it was an easy choice for me because I look at the book, look at 1948, 1949 in the context of Palestine turning into eventually Israel and the end of Arab Palestine, but that supposed controversy was not as difficult. And when I talk about when I talk about Israel it's internally, maybe I will use Israel, but oftentimes I will refer to it as sort of Israel-Palestine, but because I do think that better captures the reality, right, of that region. But yeah, and of course, Dear Palestine is a reference to the way people refer to others in letters. So Dear Palestine, dear is of course the way often letters begin with. And I called it a social history because I wanted to differentiate it from diplomatic or military histories of the war, which are much more common, I would say.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask if Max Grossman's available to unmute. She had a question.
Hey, Shay, thank you so much for this. This is really compelling and challenging stuff. You mentioned up front that you were pleased to have the opportunity to take things to an international scale. And while I agree with you that that's incredibly important, the inevitable pull back to North America leads me to a question about the impact of your work. You mentioned ethnic or national or racial diversity among Jews in Israel, but my understanding is that in the US, the Jewish ethnic diversity is much less. So if 90+% of American Jews identify as Ashkenazi and benefit from white privilege, is there something in your story that can help Americans to better understand Jews and Jewish diversity today, or do we need to recognize all of this as merely historical? How do we think about the way Jews self-identify as it clashes with ideas of white privilege at a global scale when what we as a community are mostly interested in is PG County, maybe Maryland, maybe the US?
Well, thank you for this very challenging and question. I appreciate it. I think I write stories in some ways that are sort of Palestine-Israel centric, but there are also stories that are relevant to this country. I mean, in many ways, right? I mean, we are all taxpayers in this country, and we give $3 or $4 billion a year in assistance, including military assistance to Israel. And so we have a major stake in what is going on there in major ways. But in the context of the sort of the major diversity of the Jewish population in Israel versus the relatively lack of diversity in the US, I do think that these are important stories to share in this context, and sometimes they do create some form of anxiety of some sort because of this this view that that Jews may not be the same all around the world, may have other aspirations, may have treated other group of certainly non-Jews, but also Jews in a way that we will often describe as racist. I think that is a good anxiety to have, and that these stories are important, and that they will make things better, perhaps. How? Fortunately, I'm just a historian, not in the more sort of day to day. But I mean, we are seeing. I came to the U.S. 14 years ago, and conversations that are held today in American Jewish circles are things I could not imagine that will take place. So there is major transformation discussions. They're not easy ones. They're complicated. They're difficult ones. Personally, I'm very happy that they're happening, but I get that they're very anxiety-inducing. They're anxiety-inducing for institutions, for individuals. But I think that they, at the end of this road, who knows what that would look like, they will. They are important and will make us better. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. You've spoken already a little bit about how academia has given you a chance to do things you couldn't do as a journalist. And could you spin out a little bit more? Are there ways that your career as a journalist has influenced your work as an academic? Like, and if you were talking to a graduate student who was making that transition, are there lessons to be learned?
Yeah. First of all, I one of the topics that you mentioned is my quest and struggles in the field of archival declassification. I think it's the most interesting thing in the world. I know that not everyone thinks that archival regulations and laws are important, but that is something, actually a lesson I learned as a journalist, that the fact someone says no, or that someone says that something is very highly classified and you cannot possibly look at it, doesn't mean that that's the case, and that there are ways and mechanisms also here in the United States, like FOIA and all sorts of mechanisms to try and challenge them. Now, they often don't work. I don't want to portray a picture as like, oh, well, just submit a FOIA request and all these NSA documents are tomorrow in your hand. But they are important, right? I mean, we would have not known of the FBI attempt to entrap Martin Luther King if no FOIA requests from the FBI again and again over decades would have insisted that these documents and wiretaps, etc., would have been released. Now, they're not released in Israel. That's a struggle that I'm still having, not obviously of the same, of a different context of the domestic surveillance. But I think these are really important struggles to continue. Journalists are probably best suited. I mean, a lot of my fellow historians, but journalists are probably best suited to fight for this information and these sources that are ours, right? They are, that's the principles of the democracies that we live in, that the sources are the publics, right? They're not the institutions that created them. And they may need a nudge to remember that these documents need to move from them to us. But I think the journalists are really best suited to be helping with that nudge.
And you teed up the other question that's come in perfectly. So right at the very beginning, you teased this, that your quest before the Israeli High Court is at least temporarily failed. Can you kind of fill us in on what's going on there?
Yeah. First of all, the fact that I have all these ideas about these legal struggles that I want to take is great. But if I did not have a partner with the Association of Civil Rights in Israel and, a lawyer there that is really committed to this exciting word of archival declassification, none of this would have happened. And they have been working with me for, over a decade now in these cases. We had a court case pending for several years against the Israeli Domestic Intelligence Service, the Shin Bet, who was very much in the 40s and 50s and probably 60s. They were a tool that was in some ways, or historians have argued, have worked very diligently to make sure that the government of Israel at that time, the labor government, the Mapai government, stayed in power, right? In many ways that we know from other countries, both those who are seen as democratic and those seen as undemocratic. And part of the work of the Shin Bet at that time was to suppress what was seen as Mizrahi subversive political activism, both in the context of this revolt that I talk about and other contexts. And I've asked for these documents for many years and was said, no, national security, you cannot view these. But then something very interesting happened. A veteran of the Shin Bet, an intelligence officer who retired, received access to their documents. No one has ever gone into the Shin Bet archive, which is a massive archive in Israel. And he had basically used those documents that I was told for years are national security and cannot be disclosed to write a book that was then published in just a normal press in Israel. And so it was like, all right, okay. So it's one thing that you say that this is national security and cannot be disclosed, but this guy here just written with all these documents I've been asking for 5 years. And obviously I want to see them and they refused. And so we took that to the Supreme Court. There was some years of deliberation, and the Chief Justice of Israel, Justice Chayut, gave a verdict about a year ago saying, Dr. Hazkani, he's right. The Shin Bet documents, they belong to him as they belong to all those who are citizens of Israel. However, I was convinced that in this particular case of the suppression of Mizrahi subversion in the 50s, he cannot see these documents because they threaten national security. And you can imagine how I feel about that specific ruling of the court. But it was an interesting ruling that opens up room for later litigations for those interested.
Before I let you back in, Dean Thornton Dill, I just want to thank Shay so much for taking the time today. And I want to thank everybody. I've seen many of your faces over the last year. Thank you all for coming to these events. And I really want to thank Ashley Richardson Miller, who makes everything work behind the scenes. And I desperately want to thank Dean Bonnie Thornton Dill for this series and for your ability to pose extraordinarily interesting questions in the middle of a conversation. I'm kind of in awe. And if the rest of you have ideas about how we should move this series forward over the next academic year, please send notes. Dean Thornton Dill, please welcome back.
Well, Patrick, you said it all. Thank you so much, Shay. It's been a great conversation. It could continue on. I would love to do that. And thank you, Pat and Ashley, and thank all of you for coming and for supporting this series, and those of you who come early in the morning and those of you who watch at another time of day. I've learned a lot. I hope you've learned a lot. And thank you again, and have a great rest of the semester.
Thank you.
Take care.